Joining us now from Havana is Cuban journalist Cristina Escobar, host of the Cuban political talk show Roundtable. From San Francisco, Richard Becker, the Western coordinator for the Act Now to Stop War and End Racism Coalition. Also with us from Havana is Carlos Iglesias. Carlos has been a journalist for more than 30 years. And joining us right here in the studio in Washington, D.C., Ian Vasquez, director for the Center of Global Liberty and Prosperity at the CATO Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Carlos, let me start with you. It's now official. Cuba and the United States will reopen their respective embassies in each other's countries. How significant is this development?
Well, it is a very significant moment in my opinion, because the Cuban people has been waiting for this moment for a long time, more than half a century, as there was a hostility between the two countries that now should end. Still, it's the first step, as the Cuban side has said. So a long way must go still until the final results can be assessed. So let's wait a little, because some people are saying this is a historical day. I think the historical day was 17th of December and perhaps the 20th of July, when the embassies are reopened.
Right, Cristina, is this in a sense a final acknowledgement by the United States that its policy of isolating Cuba has failed?
I cannot.
Absolutely, it's the absolutely acknowledgement of this. The fact that actually United States has been isolated now, and it's not has been the other way around. The purpose of this policy was to change the government here in Cuba, and that has not happened for 55 years old. And also has happened another thing, the fact that the intention was to isolate Cuba, but after all these decades, the main isolation has been suffered by the United States. Whole Latin America has said, we're not going to other America Summit without Cuba. And Cuba has relations, diplomatic, economic, and cooperation with all over the world, and has embassies and diplomat places all over the world except with the United States. And the United States was losing influence in Latin America and in Cuba. And actually, with the opening of the economy and the update of the foreign investment law, the American community was losing opportunities of investment here in Cuba, and that meant a big problem for them, and that's why the context has changed. And it's a big thing. Carlos Iglesias, the colleague, was saying that it's a big thing for Cuba, right, because it means that actually our government, the Cuban government, is actually being recognized by the government of the United States or none.
Right, Ian, President Obama himself said that this is a policy that has failed. He said we cannot be held prisoner by the past. What do you make of it? Good move, bad move?
I think it's a good move. I mean, it's a recognition, once again, that this is a policy that for more than 50 years failed to decrease the repression in Cuba, failed to dislodge that dictatorship, failed to improve civil or political or economic liberties. And so by establishing more normalized relations, it minimizes that the Cuban government's narrative of victimization and helps to focus the discussion on the real sources of Cuban people's misery, which of course is the regime and its own policies. And I think that that's a tremendous benefit.
Right, Richard, more than 50 years of isolation, of the embargo, of sanctions. What do you think moved the United States round to the restoration of relations with Cuba?
Well, I would also add terrorism. There was a great deal of terrorism that emanated from the United States against Cuba. I think that we would want to congratulate the Cuban people who have been, in fact, the victims of the U.S. blockade, of U.S. military policy, of all kinds of actions taken by the United States to try to bring down the government, to change the government in Cuba. That's been the aim. And so it has not succeeded, but that is really due to the steadfastness of the Cuban leadership and the Cuban people in the face of this incredible hostility. Incalculable damage has been done to Cuba's economy, not just by breaking off trade between the U.S. and Cuba, where the U.S. was the main trading partner before the revolution in 1959, but imposing a set of policies that were designed to block all other countries in the world from engaging in trade with Cuba, punishing their banks, punishing their companies. So this is a tremendous achievement, I think, for the Cuban people and for the Cuban nation.
Right, and Carlos, I'm wondering, how does this alleviate those problems in Cuba? I mean, it's one thing to open embassies in Washington and in Havana, but the embargo still remains in place. Is this more symbolic, what we're seeing right now, more than anything else?
No, it's not just symbolic. I think this is a practical step because it's the first step to have civilized relations between the two countries that have been hostile for more than a century since the beginning of the Republic. I think, nevertheless, that these relations are going to be a little bit delayed because of that hostility for such a long time. You need to make all the arrangements again to have good relations, and still there are many obstacles in the way, like the U.S. embargo. Mm-hmm. Then you have to negotiate, and in the negotiation you have to give and take.
Cristina, how is this being seen among ordinary Cubans? I mean, is there a great deal of excitement here? What are their expectations?
Michael Voss, the colleague, the correspondent of CCTV, was talking about that earlier, and the expectations are higher than the actual possibilities of what's actually going to happen. But Cuban people is very, very happy. I mean, for example, my generation, I was born in 1987. I grew up during the severe economic crisis and the strengthness of the blockade of the embargo after the Soviet Union collapse. So there is a need and a consensus towards this idea, a need of seeing an economic improvement here in Cuba that will mean also the improvement of the quality of life here in this island. So it's taken with a lot of anxiety, with a lot of curious people about what's going to happen in the future, and also with a lot of love, because as you probably know, there are 2 million Cubans in the United States, and the flow between the two countries is very important. So people coming here and people from here going to the United States. Now the main obstacle for that is still the State Department that does not give the right amount of visas needed to actually have a normal flow. There's another problem, the Cuban Adjustment Law, which is the law that gives absurd prerogative to Cubans in the United States, which means that every Cuban that wants to ask for a visa is potentially an immigrant, an illegal immigrant to the United States that wants to stay. So in general, it's a good news for Cubans, but I, as a journalist and as a Cuban that lives here, my main challenge now is actually trying to explain how complicated policy in the United States is and what actually that this could mean for Cubans.
Right, Ian, Hillary Clinton, who's of course one of the leading candidates in the next presidential election, said something very interesting. She said, look, what this new embassy does is that it helps us engage more with the Cuban people and it really promotes the efforts for positive change.
I think that's true to a very limited extent. If there's anything that can be learned from the history of U.S. policy to Cuba, to the region, is that the United States simply can't determine the outcome of events, whether it's in Cuba or in other places. And that's one of the reasons why I think that lifting the embargo, which I favor, is actually not going to result in much change unless and until there is domestic policy change and institutional change and political change in Cuba itself. That's what's going to make the difference. I don't think that lifting the embargo is going to bring in a whole lot of investment and trade unless and until those changes occur in Cuba, because nobody invests in countries that have the worst economic policies on record.
Carlos, getting to Ian's point here, I mean, we heard what Hillary Clinton said, that this will build on efforts for positive change in Cuba, but will Cuba see this the same way, or will Cuba see this as interference in its domestic affairs?
I think that now the main thing is that the possibility to change and to work normally has opened, because up to now, the U.S. policy was such a pressure on the Cuban people that it was very difficult to live. I think now the main target, not the main target, but the main achievement is that now the Cuban people can live more relaxed and can work and can live in a better way. I hope that with these steps, the American people will have more contacts with the Cuban people, and that will change the minds of many of the citizens in both sides of the straits.
All right. Richard, we know that in Washington, D.C., not everybody is on board with the president's moves. Congress, for instance, or parts of Congress, are totally opposed to what the president is doing right now. Richard, at least Marco Rubio, the U.S. Senator of Cuban descent from Florida, said he will do everything to stop President Obama. He described this latest move as, in his words, appeasement of the Castro brothers. That's, of course, a reference to Raul Castro, the current president, and Fidel Castro, his brother, former president. Can Congress roll back what is going on right now, Richard?
Well, I think that the most important question before Congress is that when the Helms-Burton Law was passed in 1996, it codified the blockade. Following the fall of the Soviet Union and the loss of 85% of its trade with the Eastern Socialist bloc that Cuba had before, the U.S. government passed the Torricelli Law and then Helms-Burton, which codified the blockade and made it much more difficult to end that aspect of the U.S. belligerency and hostility toward Cuba. So that's a very important fact. I don't think that they're going to be able to change the normalization of relations, at least at this point. It is a possibility. There was a relaxation under the Carter administration in the late 1970s that was reversed by the Reagan administration. So that's something to keep an eye on. But it does not appear that Congress is planning to relax or to end overturn the Helms-Burton Law.
Okay, we will resume our discussion in just a moment, but we're going to take a break right now. More of our conversation after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.